Let's check out this story from Minnesota in 1887 about a hermit who bought an ancient book that may have caused him to slowly peel away from his mortal coil. Our story starts with a hermit named Willis, who is working on his farm in the small town of Whitman, Minnesota. Willis was a writer. He was what they would call a recluse, so he was probably the type of guy who didn't get out much, preferring instead the company of his books and his own thoughts. Now, the specifics of how reclusive he was are a little hazy. Some versions of the story say that he hadn't left his home in years. Now, the crux plot of the story is that Willis was a writer. Willis decided that he wanted to write a book, but not just any book. He wanted to write a horror story based around haunted objects, and he thought that maybe if he really wanted to make his book scary, he should use a haunted object in his writing. So he did what anyone in his situation would do. He went to the local library and checked out the most haunted object they had. Now, again, the specifics here are a bit hazy, but according to the librarians, there wasn't anything particularly cursed or haunted sitting on the shelves, at least nothing that they knew of. So they pointed him towards their collection of old, rare, and possibly even ancient texts. Specifically, they told him to look into one book that they hadn't been able to decipher yet. They had no idea what language it was written in or what it said. The pages were brittle and yellowed with age, and the leather cover had come undone in several places. It looked, for all accounts, like your typical creepy old book, so Willis borrowed it and took it home. Once he got it home, he began to read the book, but after a few moments, he stopped. According to Willis, the second he started reading the book, he could feel evil pressing against his mind. It felt like he was staring directly into the abyss, if you know what I mean. So he put the book down, thinking that maybe it was just an irrational feeling. But when he picked it up again, the sensation came back in full force. As he sat staring at the indecipherable text, trying to figure out its origins, the sun began to set, and Willis started to panic. What if whatever this book contained was somehow extra-dimensional, he wondered, and the veil between our world and whatever other world this book came from was at its thinnest at night. He was tempted to throw it outside, but what if something followed him out? What if it killed him? He was tempted to burn it, but the book was ancient. Would whatever power it contained transfer to the flames and then come for him? He didn't know. So he made the decision to stay awake all night and keep reading until he either figured out what the book was or until sunrise. Now, as he continued to read, he noticed something strange. The letters were starting to bleed through the pages, and Willis found himself locked in a battle against the forces of darkness as the text clawed at his mind and tried to drag him into its own dimension. But Willis was a strong-willed man, or so he thought, and he kept reading. Finally, right as the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon, Willis was able to focus on one phrase in particular, and as he read it aloud, everything seemed to go silent. The fighting in his head stopped, the pressure released, and the bleeding letters froze on the page. He had done it. He survived the night and whatever the book had tried to do to him. Of course, being the practical man that he was, Willis figured that since the book was now quiet, he would go ahead and take it back to the library. But when he went to put it down, he noticed something strange. The leather binding was gone, revealing the raw papyrus pages beneath. Then he looked at his hands. They were covered in cuts and welts that looked remarkably similar to the pattern on the pages. When he raised his arms, he could see the same patterns on his chest and stomach. In fact, the entire left side of his body was covered in the same wounds that were on the book. At that moment, Willis understood. The book hadn't just attacked his mind, it had attacked his very soul. Whatever dark magic was contained within it was now leaking out and corrupting him. He ripped off his shirt, intending to bind the book to himself, to keep it shut, but the moment he touched the pages to his bare skin, the book burned him. Literally, black ash rose from where the papyrus touched him, and he quickly pulled away. But now that he'd made the connection, he knew he had to stop the book. If he didn't, whatever dark thing it contained would eventually consume him entirely. He needed to keep it closed until he could figure out a way to stop it. But how could he do that without hurting himself? He tried covering it with his blankets, but then he heard scratching sounds coming from under the covers. He tried hiding it in his closet, but then he heard scratching coming from inside the closet. The scratching grew louder and more frantic until finally he heard his own screams echoing in his home. When the neighbors came over to investigate, they found his house ransacked. Furniture was overturned, pictures were torn off the walls, and his clothes were strewn everywhere. But they didn't stick around to wonder why. They ran to the nearest police station and called for the duty officer. The police came to Willis's house and entered cautiously. He could hear noises inside and he could smell something burning, but he didn't find Willis anywhere. Instead, he found something far worse. On the wall in the corner was the answer to Willis's horrific demise. Nailed to the wall was the ancient book that had driven him insane. The pages were now completely black and the leather binding was gone. But that wasn't the worst part. The policeman soon realized Willis's flesh had literally become the binding for the book, holding it together and keeping it open to the last page. His arms were stretched out to either side of the book, his fingers nailed to the wall. His eyes were wide and vacant, staring blankly ahead, and what remained of his shirt was wrapped around the book near his spine, keeping it closed. Probably the only reason that none of the townspeople had heard him screaming. It was a gruesome scene, and it still begs the question, was Willis always this way, destined to meet a horrible end at the hands of an ancient evil, or was this the doing of something far more human? Was Willis simply killed by an occult enthusiast who thought he'd found the perfect place to stash his collection of forbidden books? We may never know. All we have is Willis's bloody corpse and a mysterious book written in an unknown language. So while we may never hear Willis's screams, rest assured his pain will live on in the pages of my stories forever. If you enjoyed this Minnesota mystery, please like this video and hit the subscribe button for more such content. Thanks for watching.